He kōna e purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai, and welcome to RNZ100, a century of stories. If you love history, inspiring and quirky characters, or a good old ponder about what makes us uniquely Kiwi, then this is the podcast for you. Yes, RNZ has been connecting New Zealanders and telling our stories for 100 years. So we've dug through the archive and picked out a whole heap of the best bits, the events and people that have shaped us, and the crazy, funny tales that have been forgotten until now. In fact, we've dug so deep that some of the audio you're about to hear hasn't been heard since it was first broadcast decades ago.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
And now for the Devil's Playground.
It was a beautiful land, a thriving community.
We'd produce a nation of gigolos.
This is Jazzercise.
Crowd refusing to go, chanting, we want rugby.
What this bill about is abnormal sex between males.
We wouldn't have known a sexual urge if we'd fallen over one.
New Zealand is brimful of interest.
I'm Mike McRoberts, and 40 years ago I started my journalism career as a cadet at RNZ. Now I'm back to celebrate 100 years of RNZ's broadcasting history. Over those 100 years, RNZ has reflected and connected New Zealanders, and this series will highlight just how wide and impactful RNZ's presence has been. This episode is Animals and Nature, dedicated to this remarkable land we call home, how we've adapted to it and eventually learned to take care of its creatures. First up, she's a zoologist. She's made documentaries about some of the world's most extraordinary animals. She's written more than 30 books, including some on topics we're about to cover. She's also an RNZ alumni, having produced and presented Our Changing World for 12 years. It's Alison Ballantyne. What a swagger of a CV that is, Alison.
Gosh, thank you. I'm looking forward to chatting about our shaky isles.
Fantastic. And as Conservation Minister, she launched the most ambitious predator-free program the country had ever seen. You might also know her from radio or the telly. She was the first woman co-presenter of Morning Report, and she hosted 9 to Noon before fronting the classic TV series Maggie's Garden Show. Welcome, the very talented Maggie Barry.
Thank you, Mike. Kia ora, it's great to be here.
Wonderful. Two great panellists. So our love of the great outdoors has endured ever since humans first set foot in Aotearoa. Our wild coastlines, our unique bird life, what's not to love, right? But Mother Nature isn't all sunsets and tui song. She is wild and unpredictable. And sometimes we've learnt that the hard way.
And I've never seen anything like the street. It was just like shaking a calf. It was great waves and you couldn't stand up. You had to hang on to one another.
That's February 3rd, 1931. It had been a summer's day like any other in Hawke's Bay. It was the first day of the new school year. Schools, as well as shops and businesses, were full when a violent shaking took hold. It was a 7.8 magnitude earthquake, 2.5 minutes of thunderous heaving and rocking. The buildings of Napier and Hastings were no match, crumbling into dust in moments. Then, just as people were getting their bearings and scrambling to find survivors, fires broke out in 3 Napier chemist shops. The town's water supply had slowed to a trickle, and the fire ended up destroying 11 blocks of the CBD. 265 people were killed across Napier, Hastings and Wairoa. Maggie, you actually had family in Hawke's Bay at the time.
My father's family, the Barrys, all come from Napier, and my grandfather had an heroic moment or three after the earthquake. It was something our family always talked about, you know, the big shake. And I had Uncle Doug Popplewell, who lost his thumb, or the top part of it anyway. He was a schoolboy and he was pinned underneath the debris, and he would wave around his topless thumb to annoy us as children. It was all very intriguing. But my grandfather, Vincent Barry, had been a Gallipoli veteran, and he was a very good horseman. He was in the Wellington Mounted Rifles. So straight after the earthquake, he got on his horse and he went out to some of the isolated communities that had become isolated because the roads had collapsed, and into the Māori villages, and he brought out the wounded and the women and the children, and he made many, many trips over the days after the earthquake. But he did what everybody else was doing, helping out where they could, and I think that's that great Kiwi Anzac spirit that comes out in times of difficulty.
Absolutely. Alison, I wonder too that we kind of get lulled into this false sense of security about our shaky isles, don't we?
We sure do, and I don't have a personal family history connection like you do, Maggie, but my dad was a geologist, and so I was brought up on tales of the Pacific Ring of Fire and the fact that we live on a plate boundary and that, we're tectonically very active. And that does shape who we are and our experiences. One of the things that occurs to me is that this use of radio, so I imagine that maybe Radio New Zealand went out to the area to talk to people like that, and I'm wondering what kind of equipment they did, or did they have a whole mobile recording unit or something that they were using, and that it was probably reasonably early on in the days when we heard ordinary New Zealanders talking about their experience and how traumatic it was.
That's true, and listening to people relating their experiences wasn't that usual on the wireless back in the day. You did have to have the plummy voice and the well-articulated vowels to get in, and even though we are the land of the long flat vowel and our vowels are our very own, I think it took a while for people to be allowed on air, and that kind of audio is the reason why we did it, I think. It was a breakthrough.
But remarkably, instead of retreating in fear, people united. Like late in the afternoon on the day the quake had reduced the town to rubble and ash, residents of Napier and Hastings had formed citizens' committees to organise food, first aid and shelter.
The community spirit which arose is something these towns will never know again. Everyone was reduced to the same level. Everyone had to queue up at the soup kitchens for a meal. Nearly everyone slept out under canvas in hundreds of tents supplied by the army. Everyone had suffered loss to some degree, and despair would have been understandable, especially when we remember that 1931 was the middle of the slump, when many were out of work and many more close to the breadline. But there was no sign of despair. The atmosphere was one of help your neighbour and let's tackle this together.
I always feel slightly inadequate speaking after one of these clips, but...
They're very posh, aren't they?
So posh.
And also very stiff upper lip.
Imagine
that
trying to
spirit
explain
that they talk about, though, we've seen that with other major disasters too, haven't we, in our history as a nation, the way that not just those towns and cities affected, but the whole country jumps in on board.
We're like that, though, aren't we? We tend to not really sit back. I think New Zealanders are obedient in times of trial, but we kind of are sensible, pragmatic people, and we get it. And when something really bad happens, I think we rally together, as some of these audio clips from way back when have described. And I think that it is who we are as a nation. I think we're a long way from anywhere. We're a long way from any help. So we tend to do the ingenuity thing and try and make it work as best we can. Stiff upper lip as well, which is not the best way to get through things, but very much a part of our tradition.
And, when I think about the Christchurch earthquake, for instance, and I was involved in covering that extensively, and just the reaction from around the country. You had the Farmy Army start up, so people in rural areas were providing food and all sorts of different things. It's just, it actually brings people together in a way, where you go and check on your neighbours, and you go and check that people you don't even know are okay and that kind of thing.
Mm. I don't know how resilience is formed and why some people come through experiences better than others. But what I do know is that sense of community for the isolated and the vulnerable makes such a phenomenal difference to their state of mind and their ability to pull through psychologically. I'm amazed at the resilience of the people of Christchurch. Those aftershocks were just extraordinary and kept on.
I actually covered the Kaikoura earthquake, and I remember landing in this sports field in a helicopter on the day of the quake with the TV3 crew. We jump out and there's a big crowd of locals there, and there's one guy sort of waving out, and I went over to go and see him, and his name was Zane, and he was great. Him and his family had a child that wasn't particularly well, so they were getting out of there. In fact, they might have been using our helicopter. And I said to him, "Oh, look, you don't know where we could find a vehicle that we can travel around in, could you?" And he goes, "Yeah, just take mine." I said, "What, really?" And he said, "Yeah." And he had a 1980s Mazda people mover I said, are you sure? We're going to probably need it for a week. I thought this is perfect for the size with all our gear. He said, yeah. I said, well, can I give you some money? He said, no. And he looked around to see where his wife was and he said, just put $100 in the old TAB account. And so we did, of course.
Fueling gambling.
Only in New Zealand, you know. Yeah. It's just fantastic. It's not just the ground beneath us we need to watch out for. New Zealand is home to 8 active volcanoes from September 1995 to October 1996. As RNZ's Mark Kreisel reported, Mount Ruapehu put on a jaw-dropping show.
The first Turangi residents knew that Mount Ruapehu had erupted again was a loud bang early this morning, and what they thought was the sound of rain falling. It wasn't rain but ash, which had been forced thousands of metres into the air, falling on their roofs. Turangi Motelier Les Gaskin says it looked as though someone had spread coal dust over the town.
I cannot see Tongariro, Ruapehu at all. The ground is covered in ash. It would be about 3 millimetres in thickness. The sun has gone completely out of the sky.
On and off for 13 months, living near the Maunga was like being in another world. Thick grey plumes of ash billowed into the sky, casting towns into darkness and blanketing roads, homes and businesses. It was a little apocalyptic, and some international news outlets took the dramatic images and ran with them.
Overseas, it's really been blown out of all proportion, if you excuse the pun. And we've had reports of the North Island blowing up and the whole of the south and north part of the North Island being evacuated.
We were watching CNN the other night, and it was a little 15-second blurb about the mountain from an American perspective, and I laughed because the announcer called it Mount Ruapehu.
Ruapehu. I feel like because there weren't any fatalities, that this was a disaster which was just a bit more of an annoyance than anything else. I remember all the flights were cancelled and you couldn't travel around the North Island or parts of the North Island. Amazing.
Well, I think those 95, 96 eruptions on Ruapehu, it was just, I think they were pretty damning for the ski fields for a couple of years. But otherwise, I think we got off quite lightly, and lots of people treated it as a bit of a local firework display. Lots of rubberneckers stopping along the road to just watch it. Of course,
great images for television too. You could set up a camera and, we just would sit there and watch it. Do you think that we look, as a nation, that we look at these sort of natural disasters as frightening threats or as exciting natural spectacles?
I think that is the price you pay for living in New Zealand. But I would also say I think you get one of these natural disasters and then people forget about it pretty quickly and just get back to normal life and seem a little surprised next time it happens.
While the moving, shaking and exploding of the land around us may have caused us a lot of distress, perhaps it's the promise of danger that attracts tourists most. At least that must have been what RNZ producers thought back in 1938. We have no other explanation for the slightly frenzied description of Rotorua, which was played to an English audience on the BBC.
And now for the Devil's Playground. A splendid place this for the seeker of new experiences. All the minor sensations of a sizzling inferno. Brimstone in the nostrils, steam in the air, and the earth at your feet a bubbling pool of molten mud and boiling water. Come with us in imagination to the Devil's Playground.
Rotorua, the Devil's Playground, is the centre of New Zealand's area of thermal activity and the main tourist attraction of our country.
Wow.
Extraordinary. I mean, that tone, that sort of frenzied, semi-hysterical. I mean, I can't imagine that people would have flocked to New Zealand after hearing that description of us being a devil's playground.
Devil's playground.
Strike it off the list, I think.
It's kind of right up there with Rota Vegas, isn't it? But I guess it would have seemed quite supernatural to go to Rotorua at that time, to see that thermal action and to see the geysers and the vapour and everything else.
Well, it is very spectacular, but I think you don't need to sell it as the Devil's Playground. Just on its own merit, it's completely intriguing and wonderful, and it's a bit of a peek into the underworld. That's the underneath of what you see happening in Ruapehu, is there's all this magma and heat under the ground driving all of this activity, and that's what the geothermal area lets you see.
Well, the geothermal activity wasn't the only thing that brought people to Aotearoa. They also came for profit. In 1840, New Zealand's biggest money maker was whaling. We hosted whaling ships from England, France and America, and we started our own steady industry too. We sold whale oil to use in margarine, leather making and even explosives. Baleen was used to make whips and corsets. But what you might not know is that this wasn't just an olden days thing. Whaling in Aotearoa carried on right up until the 1960s. In 1955, RNZ travelled to the Marlborough Sounds to join a whale hunt. Animal lovers might want to cover their ears for this bit.
Right, and now the other chaser is going right alongside us, and I can see that how the line is absolutely taut from its bow, and it's vibrating as it goes down, twanging like a violin string. And now the other chaser is going into the attack with the bomb harpoon to kill this whale and another chaser caught it. Going right in at speed. And it's thrown. Was it a hit? Then it's fighting again, another whale, and down she goes.
Well, I've got no words, but I'm sure you've got plenty, Alison.
Well, it does remind us that for an awful long time we had this idea that the world was ours to exploit and use, that it was there to feed us and for us to do anything we liked with it, And we got to remember that the first Europeans who came to New Zealand were pretty much the sealers and the whalers. All they saw in New Zealand was an opportunity for, here are these unexploited stocks of animals that we can kill for their oil and for their skins and things. And all I can say is thank goodness times have changed.
And thank goodness, 60 years later, we understand the enormity of the horror of what was going on. And, hunting rights whale to extinction, really, which is what happened. That's why they had to stop whaling. Presumably, hopefully, please let that be a lesson to people who think that we have enormous resources that are unending.
And within our population, too, as a society, we had people who led the way against anti-whaling, right? And demonstrated against whaling around the world.
Chris Beebe and others, were leaders. And I think New Zealand's always been courageous like that. We have a small voice, but we use it. And key individuals go into the United Nations or to other international arena and say this has to stop. And people look at us and go, well, who are you? You're very small. What do we care about what you say? But we continue to say it. And I think eventually we get listened to.
And the lovely thing these days is that whales still have a value, but a completely different kind of value. I mean, they are worth millions of dollars in the tourist industry because actually they are marvellous to go and see out in the ocean.
Well, it seems unthinkable now, but in this interview, Charlie Heberley, one of the country's last whalers, defended his trade like this.
In my time, I shot close on 1,000 whales. People say to me, how could you kill such a beautiful animal? Didn't you feel guilty? Even today people say that. Well, when they ask me that, I always say, well, listen, what did you have for your Sunday dinner? And they say, why? Well, I said, was it a lamb or did you have chicken? And they say, well, yes, we had chicken. And I said, well, what's more beautiful than a nice little fluffy chicken? I said, I'm not guilty. It was a business. To us, they were a challenge.
So when whaling finally came to an end in New Zealand in 1964, it wasn't because we'd had a sudden epiphany about conservation. It was because we'd shot so many whales that there were barely any left to hunt. It's estimated around 40,000 southern right whales had been killed in New Zealand waters, pushing them to the brink of extinction, and sightings of migrating humpbacks and sperm whales were rare. It wasn't until 1978 that all marine mammals were granted protection in New Zealand waters. It seems that the killing of animals in New Zealand is always going to be a source of controversy, even if that animal is a pest, and especially if what is being used to kill that pest is the chemical 1080. The possum-killing poison was first used here in 1964, but when large-scale aerial drops became the norm, protesters did whatever they could to stop them.
The Conservation Department has completed its airdrop over Maungataniwha and Raitea forests after a day in which protesters allegedly torched a scenic reserve and a farmer's hay barn. Protesters also stole at least one bag of bait, which police have since recovered. Craig Jenkins of the main protest group, Papa Atawhai, says it had nothing to do with the fires, but he can't condemn the theft of poison.
All I would say to that is I would have to approve of the destruction of the poison. Would have to be a good thing. It means it's not ending up in the forest.
It was a real dilemma, this 1080 poison that was being used to kill pests.
Well, I think we have to remember that New Zealand didn't have any native land mammals, and so we were this extraordinary land of birds, and then humans settled it, and we wanted to make it feel like England, make it feel like home, so we brought a whole lot of stuff in, and we've created a situation, and it's all only happened in the last couple of 100 years, and so the fact that we can use 1080 to control pest animals that have reached out of control numbers is something that's very particular to us. And of course, in a perfect world, you wouldn't use 1080, but at the moment, we're buying time. It's the only weapon we have that can deal with large numbers of pests across huge amounts of land.
And we've got a lot better at using it as well. When I was Minister of Conservation, I had a lot to do with the arguments around it, and I have always been outspoken for the same reasons that you've just articulated, Alison, that the very high points of our rugged landscape, which are full of vermin, and they'll go there if they are pushed out of other areas, they need to be killed in those habitats. 1080 will do it. When I started out as a gardener in the late 1970s, 1080 used to be dropped and it was coated on carrots. So they would drop about 2 tonnes of what soon became mummified carrots onto an area the size of a rugby field. It's so much better these days. You have a handful of pellets of 1080. It's biodegradable, it's water soluble, it has cinnamon flavouring to repel deer. It is a very useful tool, and we need to use it until we take the next step. The emotional debate around it hasn't been helpful. It's stood in the way, it's made it more expensive and difficult, and I just hope that, as with killing whales, we understand that sometimes you have to do the tough things to use something like 1080 to save our songbirds. It's as simple as that.
Well, there is another issue. Most scientists will admit that 1080 isn't a perfect poison. It has killed a very small number of native birds, but the Department of Conservation's Graham Elliott told RNZ in 2014 it's better than nothing.
If you go into a forest anywhere in New Zealand that hasn't had any pest control, the thing that strikes you about it is it's incredibly quiet, because our forests are buggered. The predators have been gobbling their way through our forest birds for the last 100 years. And all I can say is from the data we've got no evidence that if we are killing any birds with our 1080, it's more than made up for by the improved productivity these birds have because we've killed the rat stoats and possums that eat them, particularly while they're nesting.
That was from an interview that I recorded for Our Changing World. And, I mean, Graham is exactly right. I mean, you've already alluded to the fact, Maggie, that we've got the dosing of 1080 much better. So I think sometimes the dead birds were a result of those early operations when there was lots of dust and things around. Now that we've refined it down to using the absolute minimum amount of 1080, there's almost negligible bycatch. And even if you do lose 1 or 2 birds, you get such a successful breeding season immediately afterwards.
It's wonderful. It really works.
Yeah, the birds just come out of the forest.
Dock and dock workers are very good at killing things, and they were persecuted by a handful of noisy hunters and others who don't like chemicals, who would, snap the brake lines on their vehicles, scream at their kids in the schoolyard. I think that when you see New Zealanders not getting their way, small noisy groups can get very ugly up close and personal, and the Department of Conservation workers were brave, heroic, and got on with their job, and I commended them.
We might not make it by 2050, but it's really good to have an ambitious goal to work towards, and speaking royally, have made so many advances in the last few years, improving traps, using technology to our advantage, beginning to better understand how animals interact with traps. Progress is striding ahead.
Well, of course, our appreciation of the natural world includes a love of animals, big and small. But the way we've shown our affection hasn't always hit the mark. In the 1960s, the Bullens Circus, a travelling circus from Australia, held more than 60 elephant races in towns and cities across New Zealand. Local personalities like mayors and councillors were the jockeys, with the proceeds going to charity. In Timaru, March 1963, almost the entire population of the town gathered to watch the race, along with a couple of fizzing RNZ commentators.
What a scene this is in Stafford Street this afternoon, as these jumbo elephants come up towards us now, and what a terrific lot of excitement they're causing. You can hear the people, thousands of people that have lined Stafford Street to witness this elephant race. We'll just see if we can get out of this crowd. They're coming right up towards us, and what a noise! Listen to the elephants trumpeting.
Oh,
wow.
My goodness.
They sounded very angry too. Imagine all that could have gone wrong. Stampeding elephants and commentators getting crushed in the rush.
Street.
Oh, they made their own fun in those days, didn't they? Amazing.
Well, if you're feeling a little sorry for the elephants at this point, you should know that the winner of the race always got a giant ice cream. An ice cream on a 2-foot stick.
I just wonder what the elephants were thinking.
Let me out of here.
I did think, though, with RNZ back in the day, and in those places like Timaru, you would go out and you'd cover those things live, and so many people would have listened to that as well.
Oh, it would have been huge, and a lot safer to have listened to it at home, I think. But I remember being in radio and being at Wanaka at the AMP show, and they had the Jack Russell race, and they said, "Oh, you're a visiting celebrity, you do the commentary." And I thought, "Oh boy!" And of course, they didn't even line up properly. Jack Russells are not biddable animals, and they're all excited and sniffing each other flat out, and no one was interested. They didn't embrace the concept of starting and finishing, and several of them took off for the hills, weren't seen for days. It was the most difficult commentary I think I've ever done on radio, but a hell of a good laugh.
Well, I remember actually covering a real race, the Grand Prix down in Christchurch, and it was with the wonderful Gary Ahern from Radio New Zealand, and I was sent out to do the pits stuff, so the colour pieces, of the race. And again, one of those great RNZ broadcasts, and somehow I managed to get the ratty old Ford Escort radio van onto the track, and ended up having to do an entire lap of the track.
At speed?
Yeah. Much to everyone's annoyance, which would delay the race. I still maintain it wasn't my fault. I was told to go there, and anyway. But throughout the commentary, Gary Ahern kept saying, "And they're just going through the chicane now." And Mike, you'd know, what gear are they going through at this stage? But those broadcasts were amazing, weren't they? Because they would bring a whole community together for a very, very special event, like something like the elephant racing, for instance, or the Grand Prix. Oh, I'm having a hot flush just thinking about that now.
It's all right.
Hey, I didn't lose my job, thank goodness. Just my dignity.
Could have been career limiting, though.
Right, well, it's probably time for a nice animal story now. And what single creature has a greater legacy in this country than Shrek the sheep? The sneaky Central Otago merino had managed to evade his annual shearing for 6 years when in 2004 he was found atop a bluff sporting 27 extra kilos of wool. Tired and disorientated but not defeated, he went from the front page of the local paper to international stardom overnight.
From school kids
Hee-ho!
to prime ministers.
Hello, John. How's the world's most famous sheep?
It seems everyone wants a bit of Shrek.
That creature really put us on the map.
Oh, you're so right, Maggie, because it wasn't just Kiwis obsessed with this new cultural icon. When Shrek was shorn in Cromwell by champion shearer David Fagan, it was broadcast live by TVNZ, CNN, and the BBC to an estimated global audience of 1.2 billion people. Shrek's owner John Perriam told Checkpoint the Japanese had a particular fascination in New Zealand's fluffiest celebrity.
Some people might find it quite extraordinary that a sheep could have what you describe as a personality.
Yes, well, I mean, that's where the Japanese were coming from this morning. They were focusing very heavily on the personality of the sheep, the habits of the merino and the high country, and they were really fascinated with, aspects of the merino, that it camps on the highest part of the hill it can at night and follows the sun up during the day.
I have to say, as someone who worked in television for a long time, every time we put Shrek on the news, the ratings went crazy. He was that popular.
Well, I do have to say I'm very fond of a good sheep story.
That's true. I'm still trying to find the attraction of the story. Well, so why was it so popular, do you think? Was it just because its fleece looked magnificent, or was there something, the rebel nature of not getting shorn for 6 years?
Bit of both.
We just love absurdity. And it does remind me a bit of that whole thing from a couple of years ago with the Bird of the Year, with John Oliver in the States getting involved and campaigning for Puteki Teki to be, Bird of the Year. And
the non-New Zealand bird.
yeah, that's right. But I think it's the rest of the world looking at us going, those eccentric Kiwis, aren't they charming?
Well, look at the bird call on national radio. I remember years ago with Jeff Robinson, the Morning Report, there was a hint, a rumour, a wild rumour, not from Radio New Zealand, that the bird call was going to be no more.
Yes.
It was too old-fashioned. Honestly, the mail, sackloads of it. Oh, absolutely. And don't talk over the bird.
Yes, that was my
one.
favourite sign at Radio New Zealand in the Morning Report studio, don't talk over the bird.
New Zealand isn't only known for our celebrity sheep, we've also produced some pretty impressive naturalists. One of our great paleontologists, Joan Whiffen, had a fascinating backstory.
Now, I guess we should make it clear here that you were an amateur.
Oh yes, a rank amateur, a Hawke's Bay housewife in fact, with no scientific training, just perhaps a great deal of curiosity.
At the age of 50, Whiffen, the self-described Hawke's Bay housewife who'd left school at the age of 12, developed an interest in fossils. She, her husband and 2 kids often spent family outings fossicking for signs of ancient life. And in 1972, they embarked on a trip that would change their lives forever.
We saw this little note on the geological map, magic words. It said saurian bones in brackish water in the Tihoi Valley. So I said, right, well, we're going to have a look at that. We might find ourselves a dinosaur.
The Whiffen spent years excavating the area, hauling huge chunks of fossil-bearing rock up to the road for inspection. RNZ watched Joan Whiffen at work in 1996 when she was 74 years old.
This is a phosphatic compression, and these ones are extremely hard. So after all your hard work, then of course there may well be nothing in it. But paleontologists always hope. And you don't get anything for nothing in this occupation. You work for it.
It's split open, isn't it?
Yeah, it's split open. And for all that hard work, there's one little fish vertebra in the middle of it.
There you go, Alison. If you've got a large chunk of rock, there's always hope.
This reminds me of being a kid. Because my dad was a geologist, we didn't do holidays, we did field trips. And I can imagine Joan's enthusiasm. I mean, you're talking dinosaurs, and who doesn't like a good dinosaur story? And I think New Zealand had always felt shortchanged because we didn't have land dinosaurs. But we did, and Joan found them, working in this remote backcountry river.
Yeah, and the thing was, she was pretty much self-taught, wasn't she?
She was completely self-taught. And she earned the respect of the geologists, and they began to realise that she was this incredible discoverer, and her findings revolutionised our understanding of our fossil history. Wonderful.
Well, next is a man who dabbled in a bit of paleontology as well as just about every other natural science there is. Over his long career, Sir Charles Fleming completed major studies on New Zealand birds, fossil shells, the geology of the Whanganui coast, New Zealand's ocean floor and currents, and then he got really into cicadas, as he told RNZ in 1970.
The cicada has 2 special sound instruments at the base of its abdomen. They're membranes that are able to buckle under the influence of very strong muscles. And the membrane makes a click as it buckles in and out, something like I'm going to do now with a tin lid. In, out. in out. Now, the cicada does this with both instruments, one on each side, at such a rapid rate that it produces the kind of whirring noises and the individual notes that we can hear.
Great use of props there.
Of course, I have to say, the scourge of interviews everywhere
yes.
and audio technicians.
Oh, yes, you can always tell the stories I recorded outside in February and March.
The garden show, I must say.
Sometimes it would be deafening, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's shocking. And we had sound operators who would pretty much have nervous breakdowns in cicada season because, they've got those big boom mics, and they'd shake them in the trees. And, of course, that would only make them more inclined,
Well, Sir Charles wasn't the only naturalist whose meticulous attention to detail paid off. Nicknamed Bird Brain, as a kid, Don Merton managed to bring not one but 3 New Zealand bird species back from the brink of extinction, including the black robin.
My grandmama had a canary, you see, and she came to stay with us when I was about, I suppose, 5 or 6 years old, and my brothers and I, we very naughtily took some goldfinch chicks from a nest, goldfinch chicks, and put them in with the canary, and lo and behold, the canary, a male, mothered them and raised them. And 35 years on or so, this childhood prank had a practical bend in it, and I thought of the idea of fostering black robin chicks to some poor unsuspecting bird in order for the black robin to lay more eggs and thereby double or even treble production.
And in 1976 there were a total of just 7 black robins left, making them the rarest wild bird in the world. By the time Merton finished his cross-fostering experiment, the population had rocketed up to 100, and now the numbers are around 300. This is an incredible story, Alison.
Oh, this is the most wonderful story. And it got down to 7 individuals. What you have to realise is the entire black robin population these days is descended from 2 of those 7, Old Blue and her mate, Old Yellow.
Wow.
And Old Blue, thank goodness, lived a lot longer than robins normally do, and she, Don kept taking her eggs away, and she go, okay, I'll lay more eggs, and and I remember talking to Don, and he was very adamant that he didn't want the Big South Cape to happen again. So for people who don't know the legacy of Big South Cape, it's one of the mutton bird islands southwest of Stewart Island. Rats got there in the early 60s, and we lost 3 species. 3 species went extinct on that island, and Don was absolutely adamant that would never happen again under his watch. We could not let species go extinct, and he just wouldn't give up.
Well, let's talk about the mission to save the kakapo, the world's only flightless parrot. With a unique booming mating call and a friendly, curious nature, the kakapo is a truly remarkable bird, but we didn't always appreciate it, as this RNZ clip suggests.
The Maoris in the old days depended upon kakapos for food in the same way they did on weakers. A fat kakapo will give nearly as much oil as a weaker, of a light straw colour and not nearly so strongly flavoured. Scones or shortbread made of flour mixed with kakapo oil were quite good, much more palatable than those made from weaker oil.
I can't think of anything more disgusting.
Horrible. I haven't come across that recipe for shortbread. But you do have to remember that kakapo used to be one of the most abundant birds. If you look at subfossil remains, the length and breadth of the North and South Island, there were hundreds of thousands of kakapo. Charlie Douglas talked about you could shake a tree and 5 kakapo would fall out like apples. So it's not surprising that they got eaten. I mean, they were a resource. I wouldn't do it, and you certainly wouldn't, given how rare they are these days. And that's worth a pause for thought about how common they once were versus how rare they are now.
OK, well, along with being killed off by humans to make shortbread, kakapo were also hunted by rats and cats and stoats. When Don Merton led teams into the valleys of Fiordland to find the last remaining birds in 1975, he discovered another reason why numbers were so low.
We've been watching these birds since the 25th of January now, and we haven't seen any sign of a female. Actually, one of the birds displayed mating behaviour to a piece of wood, and this could be a bad sign. It actually attempted to mate 6 times with a piece of wood that is something the shape of a kakapo, just a few feet from its bowl, and it sort of indicate that this is the ultimate in frustration.
There's some kakapo booming. How wonderful is that? But, I mean, Don was right. At that point, they thought that Fiordland was the only place kakapo were found, and they were coming to this horrible realisation that all that was left there were male. So there was this point in the late 70s where they thought that kakapo were on the brink of extinction. And then, thank goodness, they managed to find a population with females on Rakiura, Stewart Island.
Alison, you also wrote a book on Don. What was he like? Is there any other New Zealand conservationist who's made that kind of impact, do you think?
Well, how would I describe Don? He was a reluctant hero. You know, he was actually a very quiet, shy man. I mean, you would have met him, Maggie, as well. And he was just very focused on saving birds. You know, that was his thing. But he also realised that it was really important to step up and tell that story. So, you know, he didn't like being in the limelight, but he knew that he needed to tell us what was going on, and he needed to tell us why it was important.
Such a New Zealand approach, isn't it? You know, the
yeah.
Reluctant hero.
Yes, yeah, and he inspired generations, I would say, of conservationists. And he achieved what he did just by quietly doing it.
It's a remarkable dedication that comes from the heart, isn't it?
Yes. You mentioned before we've got very good at killing things, but we're also world famous for saving things.
True. But you have to kill to save.
We do have to kill to save.
Well, we've asked a lot of questions and provided quite a few answers, I think. Alison and Maggie, thank you so much for your time. Alison, any final thoughts?
Well, there were a couple of themes that came through for me from what we've been talking about. One was that I'm really glad we've realised the value of the things that we have, the natural world around us, before we lost anything else. And that some of the people we were talking about, Joan Whiffen, Don Merton, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we owe them a huge debt of gratitude.
Maggie?
I think about the inspirational figures that have shaped my views from the time I studied horticulture at Lincoln through to today. And Ta Rob Fenwick was a dear friend and was somebody who inspired me, because what he said was, we all need to do this together. It's inherent of all of us. It's a call to arms, is how he described Predator Free 2050, for all New Zealanders to come together to fight back, that we can do this. And Don Merton, who we've spoken of a lot, and I feel that his words, which resonated for me so much when I was a Minister of Conservation, but stay with me to this day, he's really nailed it when he said, our natural species are our national monuments. They are our Tower of London, our Arc de Triomphe, our pyramids. We don't have ancient architecture that we can be proud of, but what we do have is something that is far, far older than that. No one else has the kiwi. No one else has kakapo. They have been around for millions of years, and once they are gone forever. And it's up to all of us to make sure they never die out.
Well, for a country that prides itself on a clean, green image, New Zealand hasn't always been the most welcoming habitat for our animal friends. We've hunted our whales and birds to near oblivion, and we've trotted elephants through city streets and then fed them huge ice creams. But times are changing. The kakapo that was once hunted for scone ingredients is now so beloved that we have a celebrity kakapo with 230,000 Facebook followers. It wouldn't have happened without those of us who saw our creatures as taonga from the very start. The Don Mertons, the Sir Charles Flemings, the Alison Ballances and Maggie Barrys, who have helped change the way that we view the natural world. Living on these shaky isles means life here is a bit unpredictable. We'll never be able to stop the ground from shaking or the volcanoes from blowing up, but we can keep working to protect what's uniquely ours. Mihiana kia kōrua, thank you both so much. Hey, let's do it all again in 2050.
Sounds great.
Thanks for listening to RNZ100, a century of stories. If you'd like to see more, then visit our accompanying website for extra stories, pictures, and a whole lot more audio archive that didn't feature in this episode. Check it out at rnz.co.nz/RNZ100. That's 100. And don't forget to follow RNZ100, a century of stories, so you can listen to more episodes. Available wherever you get your favourite podcasts.